I'm Jean Seaton and I'm the director of the Orwell Foundation, and I'm really delighted to launch our first ever Festival of Political Writing. And I wanted to thank, because that's my main role, really, the sponsors of the foundation, who are Joseph Rowntree, the Institute of Advanced Studies, the Political Quarterly, A.M. Heath, and best of all, Richard Blair, Orwell's own son, for the generosity that keeps our tiny team working. But I particularly want to thank tonight the London Review of Books, who we're collaborating with, the sort of thinking persons in their pocket, and you've got wonderful copies of it underneath by your chair. And I want to thank Substack, who is a really interesting new innovation, which you can write blogs on and people can make money on, as it were. But they're sponsoring this festival in particular, so we're very grateful for that. But in particular, I'm really very excited to launch what's a new initiative. We're trying to hold safe spaces open for difficult conversations in very uncertain, sort of vertiginous times. I'm particularly delighted that tonight we're going to launch this festival, which has many wonderful new events that we'll take you through perhaps right at the end, that you can come to, and our wonderful shortlists. We're going to launch it with a proper discussion with James Butler, who's a contributing editor to the London Review of Books, and who's written some very sharp things about Labour leadership, and quite recently about the local elections. So we're very grateful to him and the London Review of Books, but also the wonderful Rebecca Solnit. The book she's going to talk about, or the discussion she's going to talk about, is absolutely central to Orwell. The climate, flowers, beauty, a certain gentleness, along with a curmudgeonly impossibility, is part of him. And so Rebecca Solnit is going to talk, and I can't think of anywhere more interesting. Her books have certainly been they've been a sort of soundtrack in my life for about the last 25 years. So we're really grateful to her, we're really grateful to James, and welcome to the beginning of the Orwell Political Writing Festival. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all so much for coming. And I was asked to talk about Orwell and nature, and I will. I called the talk Thinking with Roses. Today would have been the 75th birthday of the great California science fiction writer Octavia Butler, who gave me the epigraph for my book. So I'll read it here, and we can all think of Octavia, who should be alive now. She wrote, the very act of trying to look ahead to discern possibilities and offer warnings is itself an act of hope. So two things immediately struck me when I ran across Orwell's roses, or the roses that may be the roses he planted in his garden in Wallington, Hertfordshire, in 1936 and wrote about in 1946. One was just the wonderful shock of a more direct connection to this writer who'd been so important to me but seemed so remote, this encounter with living entities connected to the living Orwell. The other was the invitation to contemplate what it meant that Orwell planted, tended, loved, wrote about roses, planted them again on his wife's grave in 1946, and again on the farmstead on the Isle of Jura in the Hebrides, and asked that roses be planted on his grave. I was in some ways using Orwell as a case study to think about the relationships between beauty, pleasure, nature, and the struggle for truth, human rights, and freedom. Delving into his life, I found a lot of surprises. I had known his work, but not his life, pretty well before I encountered those roses. But even the work looked different when, after that encounter, I returned to the work and began looking at his life through his letters and domestic diaries, as well as reading the biographies at last. I had accepted a certain ambient version of Orwell that you all probably know pretty well, stern, austere, grim, as one writer put it in the title of his book about Orwell, wintry, coughing and hacking his way through a world of bad smells and worse politics. He's often seen as a pessimist, though as Octavia Butler points out, you give warnings because you think there's still time to change course. Possibly this austere version is because serious men are supposed to be nothing but serious, or perhaps this other side of him, the passionate gardener and defender of pleasure, was just considered insignificant. I think it was significant, and I think in this era it has a particular significance when nature itself is so vexed and troubled and in question. But also significant because he thought it was, by giving over a lot of his time and attention to the natural world. The evidence for this is copious. He declared on a 1940 questionnaire for a biographical dictionary, "Outside my work, the thing I care most about is gardening, especially vegetable gardening, a hint approximately the size of a whale." Orwell invoked the natural world in his writing in various ways, most obviously as vivid descriptions in most of the novels from Burmese days to the Golden Country in 1984, most lushly in Coming Up for Air and A Clergyman's Daughter. Orwell's familiarity with farm animals was essential to Animal Farm. The natural world of Spain is evoked in Homage to Catalonia and the monstrosity of the coal mines in The Road to Wigan Pier. Those mines and the poisoned blackened surface world around them were gouged and wounded nature, and of course when burned, coal caused other poisons, such as London's periodic toxic fogs, before the air pollution laws were passed. It was one of the curious things to me. One biographer described his move to Jura as suicidal, and it seemed so peculiar to me that people considered living in that absolutely deadly air of London, which killed 7,000 people at least in the Great Fog of 1952, to be a reasonable thing to do, and to move to an island with clean air, an unreasonable thing. But I digress. So, it was his 1946, A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray, that had prompted me to go looking for his fruit trees for a friend and find the roses for myself. But I'd always thought that the essay was an outlier, a trace of who he might have been. It, in fact, was who he was, and other essays and books also take notice of and take joy in the natural world. His domestic diaries are really garden journals, including observations of birds, insects, small mammals, weather, and seasons. As many writers do, he relied on metaphors and images drawn from the rural and natural world. Maybe I should say all writers. Squid ink and snow are both metaphors in politics and the English language, for example. And another metaphor drawn from nature became crucial to 1984, as we'll see later. It was the sight of a small boy whipping a huge cart horse that prompted Animal Farm, and that knowledge of farm animals that allowed him to use them as accurate in themselves and stand-ins for human characters. While the two most common arguments in defense of the natural world and our relationship to it are that we need it bodily and spiritual, there's a third I've considered significant. It is from the natural, rural, and embodied world that we draw our metaphors and analogies that help us think. They play an irreplaceably crucial role in our imaginative and intellectual life. Our language has been made vivid with imagery from farming, from the sea and sailing, from bodies, water and weather, the earth and the sky, from plants and animals and seasons. What happens to our imaginations in an age of staring at devices is a story we're now living through. I don't think it will end well. In his time, nature was supposed to be a stable and apolitical realm outside history. Bertolt Brecht famously wrote in a 1939 poem, "Ah, what an age is this, when to speak of trees is almost a crime, for it is a kind of silence about injustice." They didn't know what we do, that we are changing nature itself with our activities, notably the burning of fossil fuel and other greenhouse gas emissions that have set us on a path of swift and destructive climate change. If you wanted to get down into the fossilized weeds, you could note that coal, oil, and gas are the toxic dregs of forests from the deep past, and that trees then and now play a huge role in sequestering atmospheric carbon dioxide. In our age, not to speak of trees is almost a crime. But nature was political in Orwell's time too, as both contested and exploited resources and as metaphors, ideas, and images. Everyone invoked nature to justify their political program. The Soviet Union rejected Darwinism as bourgeois and promoted the pseudoscience of Trofim Lysenko, who contributed to the chronic agricultural problems of the Soviet Union and the food shortages there, as well as to the silencing, imprisonment, and execution of some of that country's best scientists. Lysenko's impact in the larger repression of truth was a grim inspiration for 1984, of truth in science. Part of the Soviet rejection of Darwinism was a rejection of the capitalist world's own pseudoscience of social Darwinism become eugenics in service of class hierarchies and white supremacy, often with very real impacts such as forced sterilization in the USA and Canada. Of course, the Nazis took eugenics to their monstrously logical conclusion. They analogized Jews to lice and other insects and used insecticide in the gas chambers to press home that point, while celebrating a nationalist identity with iconography of athletic young bodies, mountains, and forests. Speaking of trees. The idea that nature is apolitical is itself a political idea, one that renders invisible that by nature we mean both economic and ideological realms, that have everything to do with colonialism and imperialism, fuel wars and ethnic cleansing, define acceptable norms of gender and sexuality, and more. Like many in his era, Orwell saw the natural world mostly as a source of personal and practical sustenance. But I thought it noteworthy that his family had been not just intensely involved in British colonialism, but that colonialism was all about plants. His father's work as an opium agent in India, his maternal grandfather's business as a teak merchant in Burma, and the more distant paternal ancestors involved in slavery and sugar production in Jamaica. The natural and rural world can also be a site of exploitation, and Orwell knew that and addressed it as colonialism and as labor conditions. Nevertheless, pleasure in nature does matter to Orwell, and I think to our age, to the Anthropocene, and I'm here to make the case for them. Not why Orwell matters, but why these things mattered to Orwell and do for all of us. Dorian Lynskey made a wonderful comment on my book, Orwell's Roses, noting that while we all know what Orwell was against, mine was a book about what he was for. I think more broadly, anyone engaging in politics in one way or another, all of us do, needs to know what they're for, or they become so embittered and shaped by what they're against, they lose sight of why they're fighting. Orwell knew. His friend George Woodcock wrote, "The source of his self-regenerative power lay in his joy in the ordinary common experiences of day-to-day existence, and particularly of contact with nature. He fed from the earth like Antaeus." Woodcock seems to be saying that Orwell gathered strength from this to do his other work, and that's one of the justifications for spending time with the people, places, and things you love and take joy in. Orwell's pleasures were quotidian, and he relished the fact they could be almost anyone's pleasures: a good cup of tea, beer in the right kind of mug, an old-fashioned pub, a junk shop, children's stories, popular songs, racy postcards, the birds in the sky, and the flowers growing out even of the rubble of bomb sites in London after the Blitz. He both made a lot of room for them in his life and celebrated and defended them in his work, for himself and everyone. They are part of what he was for, along with the freedom and privacy to choose these or other pleasures. Arguments about nature are always also about human nature, who we are, what we need, what matters or should matter to us. Thinking about Orwell's Roses led me to the phrase bread and roses. Though the phrase is well known, even well worn, the boldness of its premise may have faded from view. It comes from a talk given in 1910 by Helen Todd as she was campaigning for women's votes in the Midwestern USA. Bread and roses was a pretty slogan, but a fierce argument that more than survival and bodily well-being were needed and were being demanded as a right, including a right to nature, which Todd expressed directly. It was in a way an argument about human nature. Roses in these declarations stood for the way that human beings are complex, desires are irreducible, that what sustains us is often subtle and elusive. That is, in the phrase bread and roses, bread meant all the practical, quantifiable stuff necessary to survival, but we cannot live by bread alone. Roses stood for what fed the mind, the soul, the imagination, and they mean that we also have a right to those things, to nature, culture, beauty, leisure. It was a remarkable manifesto in 3 words. Orwell, too, defended human complexity, pleasure, leisure, beauty, joy. We do politics in the name of meeting human needs as well as rights, and what those needs are and aren't is often the subject of furious debate. In a very straightforward way, the things you love that give you pleasure and joy keep you going. In the case of Orwell, his commitment to them was striking because he was in the left, and much of the left has an austere utilitarian or puritanical bent, pronouncing everything not objectively necessary to sustain life and further the revolution, superfluous, trivial, and irrelevant, indulgent, and so forth. Defending the bread, but dismissing the roses, in other words. He wrote in his Tribune column, "Last time I mentioned flowers in this column, an indignant lady wrote in to say that flowers are bourgeois." I love that lady. She's so valuable to me in my argument, and I think to him in his arguments. I presume she meant flowers as ornaments and commodities, as superfluities. One might mention that flowers existed for millions of years before humans, let alone the bourgeoisie did, and most of what we eat is either flowering plants or creatures dependent upon them. But I don't want to defend flowers as utilitarian. I want to defend human beings as needing pleasure and beauty, or rather look at Orwell doing so. That Orwell insisted on these things was an act of resistance of sorts within the left, one he returned to with his 1946 essay in praise of the common toad. He wrote, "Is it wicked to take a pleasure in spring and other seasonal changes? To put it more precisely, is it politically reprehensible while we're all groaning, or at any rate ought to be groaning, under the shackles of the capitalist system, to point out that life is frequently more worth living because of a blackbird's song, a yellow elm tree in October, or some other natural phenomenon which does not cost money and does not have what the editors of left-wing newspapers call a class angle? There is no doubt that many people think so," he wrote. Clearly he did not, and clearly he's having a lot of fun with that long middle sentence too. And it's that Orwell is playful, funny, and witty, I think also has sometimes been overlooked. But that middle sentence is really, "Is it wicked to take a pleasure in spring while we're all groaning, or at any rate ought to be groaning, under the shackles of the capitalist system, to point out that life is frequently more worth living because of a blackbird's song, a yellow elm tree in October, or some other natural phenomenon which does not cost money and does not have the editors what the editors of left-wing newspapers call a class angle?" That is definitely poking a lot of people and poking fun at them. Defiance also runs through the essay, as with this sentence. I mention the spawning of the toads because it is one of the phenomena of spring which most deeply appeal to me, and because the toad, unlike the skylark and the primrose, has never had much of a boost from poets. Toads are underdogs, so is he. He writes, "How many a time have I stood watching the toads mating, or a pair of hares having a boxing match in the young corn, and thought of all the important persons who would stop me enjoying this if they could." Still, he's arguing for a nature that's for everyone because it's free. He concludes, the point is that the pleasures of spring are available to everybody and cost nothing. Even in the most sordid street, the coming of spring will register itself by some sign or other, if it is only a brighter blue between the chimney pots, or the vivid green of an elder sprouting on a blitzed site. In the months before he moved to Jura, in May of 1946, he wrote an astonishing number of essays, mostly on modest pleasures, and I speculated that it might be because when you have to produce a lot of stuff, going to what you remember and can call up at will is a lot easier than doing researched essays, speaking as somebody who makes a living the same way. But it was this kind of wonderful reverie he entered into about all kinds of pleasures, where it felt like he was pulling himself out of the post-war gloom and his recent, the death of his wife and all the other difficulties he was facing, and maybe he was trying to pull other people by celebrating all these things. So essays mostly on modest pleasures, but he apparently produced his landmark essay, Why I Write That, Season 2. In it, he declares, anyone who cares to examine my work will see that even when it is downright propaganda, it contains much that a full-time politician would consider irrelevant. And this is a really famous passage, but the third sentence I'm going to read is really, once again, really makes his statement about the importance of nature to him. So second sentence, I'm not able and do not want completely to abandon the worldview that I acquired in childhood. Nobody's quite sure what that worldview is, but it might be the natural world and all those little pleasures and big pleasures. Third sentence, so long as I remain alive and well, I shall continue to feel strongly about prose style, to love the surface of the earth, and to take a pleasure in solid objects and scraps of useless information. And it's such a driving, positive sentence and list. And he goes on, it is no use trying to suppress that side of myself. The job is to reconcile my ingrained likes and dislikes with essentially public non-individual activities that this age forces on all of us. It's a remarkable manifesto in which Orwell asserts he's obliged by conscience to engage with political life, but attached by instinct and delight to this other stuff, including the surface of the earth. Not long before, he was composing another trio of sentences that represents this side of him. Reporting from Stuttgart in late 1945, he wrote in Tribune, a dead German soldier was lying supine at the foot of the steps. His face was a waxy yellow. On his breast, someone had laid a bunch of the lilac, which was blooming everywhere. A lot of journalists would have considered the lilacs irrelevant. A lot of editors would have struck that third sentence. But it has much to tell us. As he said, anyone who cares to examine my work will see that even when it is downright propaganda, it contains much that a full-time politician would consider irrelevant. The lilacs say that this person, an English reader would look upon as the enemy, was someone's friend or beloved, that this corpse had a personal as well as a political history. They say that a city in ruins was also in the midst of springtime, that in the linear time of war and history, the cyclical time of nature persisted. They insisted on complicating the categories of thought, of resisting the simple stories in favor of more complex ones. They also tell us that Orwell had an eye for flowers, even as a war reporter. He was an empiricist who distrusted ideologies when they blinded people to actualities. After all, assumptions and categories can become where thinking goes to die, and mind shut off to the slippery richness of experience. In 1984, Winston Smith turns to his own consciousness as a sort of fortress he can defend against the propaganda, the memory hole, the lies and numbing and obedience. I first read 1984 as a teenager, and I've read it several times since at various intervals in my life and public life. But after I encountered those roses in Wallington and began looking at the domestic diaries, the letters, and the biographical material, I was astonished when I read it again and found a book quite different than I had remembered. Shockingly different and strangely lush. The book's famous opening passage set the scene, bleak future London under Big Brother, from the constant surveillance to the shoddiness of the gin and cigarettes. But then suddenly, from the table drawer, Winston took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick quarter-size... Sorry, let me do that again. Somehow I'm very tongue-tied. I kind of didn't sleep the night before because there was no darkness in Iceland and I had a very early flight, and things are not flowing as they sometimes do. But then suddenly, from the table drawer, he took out a pen holder, a bottle of ink, and a thick quarto-sized blank book with a red back and a marbled cover. It was a peculiarly beautiful book, its smooth, creamy paper a little yellowed by age. Orwell continues. Something sensuous has burst in on the bleakness. Winston has taken a risk just to buy this book, and takes a greater one to begin writing in it. And the sensory pleasure of ink and paper, and the physical act of writing, and the intellectual pleasure of self-expression are somehow united. Taking risks for pleasure, beauty, meaning, depth, connection, and freedom of mind continue throughout the book. That is to say, Winston's rebellion consists largely of living deeply and passionately, of cultivating independence of thought and disobedience of spirit, and of pursuing things that mean something to him, including a love affair, a visit to the landscape he calls the Golden Country, a chance at revolt, which turns out to be a trap, and a recollection of a nursery rhyme from his childhood. It's such a strange book. The Golden Country he's dreamed about, seen in detail in his dreams, and then Julia brings him to it. And this is not the kind of sort of bourgeois, the kind of conventional realist novel that I thought it was when I went back to it. There's so much kind of strange, dreamy subjectivity and kind of almost more fantasy than science fiction in it, and stuff that's just kind of inexplicable. So, and also so much pleasure and beauty, always furtive, always dangerous, but popping up over and over again. Orwell instructs us on what resistance can consist of through the book, often by offering an ideological context for Winston's thoughts and deeds. For example, he writes, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command." Winston demonstrates resistance to that with the thought that the obvious, the silly, and the true have got to be defended. Truisms are true, hold on to that. The solid world exists, its laws do not change. Stones are hard, water is wet, objects unsupported fall towards the earth's center. And kind of like the Buddha tormented by demons, as he sits under the tree he'll become enlightened under, who touches the earth to reconnect and to escape delusion. Winston, I know that's a stretch, but Winston keeps going back to the actual against the propaganda that swims all around him, and that he's actually citing nature and physics as a way to try and keep his mind clear. It's kind of amazing and kind of lovely and kind of fits in my topic here of Orwell and nature. So here, firsthand experience and the laws of physics are a counter to the totalitarian regime that aspires to control thought, memory, fact, and knowledge. Orwell in his own life and in his art constantly goes back to these touchstones of the immediate, to direct encounter, especially with the natural world. This in itself, of course, does not topple regimes, but I believe it contributes to the construction of a robust self, not so easily swayed and subjugated by an authoritarian regime. Becoming an observer and a recorder of experience sets you up to rely on your own authority and your own capacity to perceive, analyze, and remember. More broadly, I think this is an argument for art that's not propaganda per se. If propaganda tells us what to think and feel, good art fortifies our capacity to feel, think, know ourselves and our world, helps build that self more capable of independent thought, of moral clarity, of awareness of self and others, not what to think, but how and maybe why. Hannah Arendt famously declared, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and between true and false no longer exist." You can invert that to note that recognizing that distinction and our own capacity to determine it are part of resistance to totalitarianism. Those who trust the evidence of their own eyes and ears and their own discernment are capable of resistance. You can see how urgent this job is in our own time. After all, I speak to you the day after Americans testified before Congress about their resistance to being threatened and bludgeoned and intimidated to go along with Trump's big lie. And this is American business. None of you were obliged to follow it. But the third of the hearings the House Intelligence Committee was holding happened, and a black woman and her mother, who were election monitors and who were falsely accused of altering the outcome of the Georgia election, and then persecuted, threatened, attacked in every possible way, testified, and so did Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, who Trump demanded fined him 11,000 votes, and who refused, and who then had, I think, his daughter's home invaded while she was dying, and all kinds of threats and harassment against him as well. So, leaving aside Brexit and Boris Johnson, which I'm not competent to discuss, I can just stick with Americans to say that these things are really, as topical as yesterday's testimony. You can see Winston struggling in his own time to hang on to the facts and not get swept up in the lies. His victory is not permanent. He will be destroyed in the end, but perhaps all victories are temporary, including that of totalitarian regimes. As Margaret Atwood points out, the appendix to 1984 is written in such a way as to indicate that the regime of Big Brother is in the past tense, if not how that happened. Orwell had written in 1944, "The really frightening thing about totalitarianism is not that it commits atrocities, but that it attacks the concepts of objective truth. It claims to control the past as well as the future." And of course, I could have cited Putin as well as Trump, as well as so many other regimes and would-be tyrants in our time with this novel that has never ceased to be relevant, unfortunately. Within the novel, Goldstein's book declares the empirical method of thought on which all scientific achievements of the past were founded is opposed to the most fundamental principles of INGSOC, the ideology of the regime. O'Brien, bless you. O'Brien, while torturing Smith, boasts, "There will be no laughter, no art, no literature, no science. There will be no distinction between beauty and ugliness. There will be no curiosity, no enjoyment of the process of life." Syme, one of Winston's colleagues working on his Newspeak dictionary, asserts, "Orthodoxy means not thinking, not needing to think. Orthodoxy is unconsciousness." In a sense, in this book, thinking itself is thought crime. Perhaps art, literature, science, laughter, curiosity, enjoyment are too. O'Brien's opposition to beauty is striking, and elsewhere, Orwell notes of the glass paperweight with a bit of coral Winston buys in the same junk shop as the book. It was a queer thing, even a compromising thing, for a party member to have in his possession anything old, and for that matter, anything beautiful, was always vaguely suspect. Of course, beauty is inseparable from desire and individual perception. The old is linked to memory. The beautiful old book and paperweight are signs of a subversive mind. One of the joys of rereading Orwell's works for my book was finding his jaunty essay on junk shops from early 1946 and reflecting on how readily someone might dismiss it as a lightweight and trivial essay. It nevertheless contains a description of Orwell's own encounter with such glass paperweights with bits of coral in them, which would become a key symbol in his book that is a monumental endeavor in defense of liberty and consciousness. That is, wandering in junk shops was research for writing this ferocious novel, still being censored in Russia and Belarus. Just as lilacs were not an essential to the war journalism, so meandering in junk shops was not entirely irrelevant to the work of opposing fascism and totalitarianism. You might call all that wandering and observing, furnishing the imagination. Even the essay on toads is an argument against utilitarianism. Those essays on pleasure from 1946 were all laying the groundwork for this novel. Perhaps you cannot even have the bread if you spurn the roses. Another famous assertion from 1984, the sexual act successfully performed was rebellion, desire is thought crime. I'm a bit taken aback by that successfully performed qualifier and want to stand up for non-performative sex. But seriously, why is desire thought crime? Desire arises from the body and the individual consciousness. It strains against obedience and against the dictatorship of what one should want and crave. It is your own drive, not the regime's. Orwell once wrote, we know only that the imagination, like certain wild animals, will not breed in captivity, and desire can be a kind of wild imagination. Another way to put it is that when imagination and desire assert themselves, we become feral, as in free in some sense, free to know ourselves even if we're not free to fulfill our desires. We become natural, and like the singing thrush in the book's Golden Country, we exist for our own sakes in the moment. There are more instructions on the power of desire. Orwell writes, "Mere debauchery did not matter very much, so long as it was furtive and joyless. Not merely the love of one person, but the animal instinct, the simple undifferentiated desire. That was the force that would tear the party to pieces." Most startling of all to me on my rereading of 1984 were Winston's 3 observations of a working-class washerwoman singing in a beautiful contralto voice and hanging out diapers on a clothesline. He sees and hears her doing so out the window of the love nest he rents in the Pearl District upstairs from the junk shop where he got the beautiful book and the glass paperweight. Orwell writes, "One had the feeling that she would have been perfectly content if the June evening had been endless and the supply of clothes inexhaustible, to remain there for 1,000 years, pegging out diapers and singing rubbish. She stands like a goddess, semi-immortal, immensely powerful, straddling the past and future with her song about lost love and her toil on behalf of the babies who will be the future. The book is often thought of as despondent because Winston will be tortured and destroyed, but Winston himself tells us repeatedly that if there is hope, it lies with the proles. So she is hope. He is not. Winston, seeing her, thinks, the proles were immortal. You could not doubt it when you looked at that valiant figure in the yard. Just before the thought police come to seize Winston and Julia, he sees and hears her one last time, and he contemplates her in a flight of association that leads back to roses. And this was a total shock to me to find in the book. Not what I remembered, not what I'd paid attention to. It's actually been one of the great pleasures for me of having lived a fairly long time, of going back to works of art periodically as a different person in a different era and seeing different things in them than I did before. Not always a pleasure. Sometimes books I found perfectly acceptable turn out to be more racist or homophobic or misogynist than I noticed before, or I'm less tolerant of those things. But there's also just finding new things and things you thought you knew. That's such a pleasure. And so he contemplates her in a flight of association that leads back to roses. Orwell writes, "It struck him for the first time that she was beautiful. The solid, contourless body, like a block of granite, and the rasping red skin bore the same relation to the body of a girl as the rose hip to the rose. Why should the fruit be held inferior to the flower?" It's unclear how Winston could think with roses. It doesn't seem likely that he's terribly familiar with them. Perhaps he is, but it's perfectly clear how his creator could. I found it striking both that Orwell in the end found the impetus to celebrate a middle-aged, working-class woman, and that he did so by the deployment of a metaphor of flower and fruit. His knowledge of roses was one of the tools he used. His storehouse of organic metaphors was crucial to his political work. It's a passage in which beauty and politics are inseparable, in which flowers aid an anti-authoritarian agenda, by this writer who recognized better than almost anyone in his time that authoritarians don't want just to control the practical stuff, but they want to control consciousness, thought, ideas, memories, and emotions, and thus truth and meaning. It's an indication that even if Orwell went to the natural world for refuge, doing so helped make him able to do his valuable work in the political world. I believe this is the case for all of us, and that the most important work in our era involves defending the natural world, which sustains not only bodies and souls, but imaginations. Thank you.
Hello. Hopefully this is, yes, that sounds like it's on. Put that down and remove this cup. Right, well, I have the rather simpler job now of just responding to what is, like the book itself, a multifaceted and multi-layered response to Orwell. And thank you for such a wonderful lecture. I thought, just to explain, I'm going to ask a few questions and then I'll open out to the floor and let you all come in. I'm sure there are plenty of questions in the room. But I wanted to start just by, by thanking you for for not giving us the sort of austere and rather forbidding genius of English socialism, who I think, whether happily or unhappily, presides over all left-writers in the UK. I think all of us have to deal with him in one way or another. And I wanted to offer you maybe a thought that springs both from what you were saying today and from what you were saying and from one of the passages in the book, which is to do with the changing relationship we now have to nature. And so in the book, you write that people in Orwell's time, and Orwell himself, could think of nature in a way as being a sort of infinite store of value, right? As a sort of perfectly abundant source.
And utterly stable, this sort of backdrop that was you're not going to change no matter what. Right,
and now when we confront nature, it's always inevitably, even if it's in admiration or simply appreciation of beauty, there's always perhaps some sort of darker note, some sort of sense of instability or catastrophe or our own sort of implication. So what is it like coming to Orwell with an awareness of climate change, to Orwell's nature writing in particular? How does it change the way in which you read Orwell, as someone who's written very extensively on climate yourself?
And I didn't want to pretend Orwell cared about climate change and be ahistorical, but I found that his journey to the coal mines really kind of profound in that he recognized just how filthy and poisonous it was. And he has this wonderful sentence, I cannot quite recall verbatim, but about how easy it is to not think about where coal comes from. And that men come and put it in his coal chute and you can pretend it comes from nowhere. Just like when you fill your gas tank with your car, or wait, you all have petrol tanks, don't you? It's very easy to pretend it comes out of the pump and not think about, Saudi Arabia or in fracking and all those things. And so much of our work as environmentalists and human rights activists is just trying to get people to reconnect a world of alienated commodities, to understand where fossil fuel comes from and where the carbon dioxide goes when you burn it and things. So there's ways in which, writing this book, I wanted to bring that kind of awareness we have now and kind of see where it sat with Orwell, and he does think about the coal in a way that felt very prescient, just as kind of poisonous, troublesome, and easy to ignore. And he recognizes essentially Britain is built on coal. And and his distrust of, a lot of the leftists of his time had that kind of, let's destroy the past, nature is sentimental, technology will build a better world. And his kind of William Morris-like distrust of it was one of the things I really like about him. So I will never say that he had anything to say about climate change, because no one did. But he has a mindset that I think is very akin to ours in terms of those things. And but it is also really striking for me, there's a wonderful, actually it's a Granta essay. When I was a very young writer, Granta magazine, I ponied up for a subscription, and around the late 80s there was a bunch of extraordinary political essays, which I remember vividly. I still have some of them. There was a wonderful essay that sort of described as though the world lay in ruins, describing just the starving people in Berlin and Dresden and the utter wreckage and things like that, and of course Hiroshima and Nagasaki and things, and Tokyo that had been firebombed. And I inverted that in this book to say that, the World War II produced a lot of ruins, but the oceans had not acidified, the Amazon rainforest was really intact. The parts per million of carbon were closer in 1945 to where they were in 1745 than where they've been. Actually, for climate change, 1984 is the last good year when we crossed the 350 parts per million threshold. So all those things come to mind, a kind of way of thinking through Orwell and around Orwell about climate, and seeing, at least in his devotion to the natural world, a willingness to think that it's important and worthy of attention in a way that, like, Bertolt Brecht didn't.
And one of the threads in both the lecture and the book, I think, is this attention to the sort of overweening ambition of people, on all sides of the political spectrum, but including people on the left, to, as you say, completely remake nature in their own image. And one of the things that I think is, I think there's a productive and quite sort of difficult tension that runs through the way that you're thinking about gardens and Orwell's gardening and his attention, especially to roses, because I thought it was interesting, that line of his that, I'm especially interested in vegetable gardening, right?
Yeah.
And vegetable gardening is useful, right? It produces things we can eat, it produces things that we can feed people with. Planting roses is not useful. It is just beautiful.
And that's what I loved. And it was actually, those of you who've read the book know, my friend Sam is a documentary filmmaker who may yet do a documentary about trees. And in talking about trees, his interest in trees planted by notable people, I mentioned what I'd known since I read the essay, A Good Word for the Vicar of Bray, that Orwell had planted fruit trees. And so Sam was interested, which is why I went to Wallington on a scenic detour between London and Cambridge in 2017. And the fruit trees didn't really require much thought. You can be perfectly conventionally socialist. Fruit trees produce food. They also produce shade and bird habitat and flowers and beauty and all kinds of markers of the seasons and all these things that are not so utilitarian. But it was really the roses that made me say, what's up with this democratic socialist planting roses? It really raised the question of how was Orwell himself staking out room in his life and his imagination for pleasure, for beauty, for the useless. And it's really quite striking in 1984, both the thrush in the golden country and the glass paperweight with a bit of coral are celebrated for being essentially useless, for not being means to somebody else's end, but being ends in themselves. And so and that's what led me to find that Orwell loved flowers, planted them every time he planted a garden. But I will put in, just as I put in a word for unsuccessfully performed and non-performative sex, I'll put in a word that vegetable gardens, I'm a Californian, we got some beautiful crops out there. And, vegetable gardens can be beautiful too. And I kind of love that, it was a bit of a shock to find both that Orwell is a lot more like Henry David Thoreau, who was famous for the melons he raised, many, many species, and wrote about raising beans in Walden, and that he was kind of in a weird way a do-it-yourselfer, which I think was partly poverty. Before the war, raising his own food was a good economic call, but he greatly enjoyed it. And then when he went to Jura, and rationing was on, and producing your own food was a really good way to eat better than off your ration book.
And it's one of the things that's kind of so striking, is that certainly within English politics, and I think within the kind of literary politics of gardens, they tend to be fairly conservative. So in Britain, Chamberlain after the war said, well, we're going to give people gardens because with every spade of manure they layer on an ounce of this spirit of revolution they may have contracted while they've been in Europe, will ebb out of them.
So he thought it was placidifying in a kind of we must all tend our gardens way.
Yeah, and it's that Candide kind of, or one of the interpretations of the end of Candide, which is of course the most famous, I think, probably political literary garden, is the end of Candide, we must cultivate our garden. And it's often been interpreted as a kind of retreat from the world, as I think fairly gardens can often be. You do find something else, I think, in the way that you're thinking about gardening and cultivation and the use of the soil. I wonder if you could just say a bit about, that sort of conservative reading of the garden, whether it's fair to tar Orwell with it.
The part of Orwell, like William Morris, I think was very nostalgic for rural, old Britain and not very enthused about the versions of the future they saw. But it was always a kind of solidarity with the peasants and a desire to have plenty for everybody, a kind of pre-enclosure Britain perhaps. And I absolutely get how it can become sentimental, how it can become conservative. And, I find it kind of fascinating how the British aristocracy naturalized themselves in the 18th century to suggest that they were as authentic, they belonged as deeply as nature itself, all those paintings of people, the Gainsboroughs and things in the countryside. And I found it kind of fascinating that Sir Joshua Reynolds' biggest painting is of Orwell's ancestor hanging out with some slightly more aristocratic people in a classical landscape. So, but gardening can also be really radical. And I was a huge fan of Reclaim the Streets here at the end of the 90s. And I remember one of the things they did of protesting some of the road building, they had people on stilts wearing giant hoop skirts standing on an overpass, jackhammering it to plant trees. And I love the people who've been sitting in trees to prevent them from being cut down. And then the U.S. guerrilla gardening has often been part of, Occupy Wall Street, Reclaim the Streets, kind of creating radical spaces in the streets. And there was a period, I'm not sure where it stands now, but where young people, and it could get really kind of twee and precious, but backyard chickens and raising tomatoes and things like that, and knitting and things, and it felt like people wanted to just have a direct relationship to production that felt honest and connected, as opposed to H&M and IKEA, and but there is a lot of people doing that, and in the U.S. when the pandemic hit, this vegetables or all seed sales, garden seed sales, and other garden stuff just immediately doubled, and everybody decided to just garden. And of course in the, victory gardens. So, there's so many things. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is people in concentration camps, and particularly actually in Japanese internment camps, because the U.S. imprisoned all the Japanese Americans on the West Coast as potential enemy aliens in one of the more shameful chapters. Although I guess the U.S. has 1,001 shameful chapters, but that's another conversation. But they didn't just build gardens, but they built Japanese gardens in the camps they were imprisoned in. So it can really be a radical reassertion that we will not be dehumanized, we will not, be without culture. So there's a wonderful book about gardens during wartime, Defiant Gardens.
I mean, I think one of the things that's so striking about the lecture you've just given and the book is this insistence that bread and roses are inseparable, right? That actually it's not a question, because the obvious objection that can be raised, and that I think is often raised by people who are perhaps more orthodox than either you or I, is that, these things are, is the kind of classic, Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens.
Yeah.
Right? That, it doesn't actually, the gardens, they're all well and good, but actually they are secondary to the real matter of the struggle itself. I think you've offered a substantial rejoinder to that already in the argument of the lecture. I suppose what I wanted to, maybe, just spend a little time on is there's a difficulty, it seems to me, and I was sat there thinking about this as you were talking about 1984, which is you find in 1984 this extraordinarily dreamy book, this extraordinarily unusual book, which actually, despite being dystopian, blends these extraordinary moments of utopia, and utopianism is something about which I think both you and Orwell are ambivalent. And yet, one of the things that seems to me rather double-edged about 1984's continued both relevance and success is how easy it has become in this moment to think in dystopian terms, to think in terms that project from the moment that we're in now and our experiences of the catastrophic or the chaotic or the crisis-ridden, forward into an inevitable trajectory towards dystopia. I wonder if you have any more words on the recovery of, if not a kind of totalizing utopia, which can be worrying in its own right, then how to recover those sort of extraordinary utopian moments or impulses that are scattered through Orwell's work and through 1984, but which also gave you that extraordinary epigram with which you started.
My friend Carla Bergman distinguishes between happiness, which can be very conservative, which is about trying to eliminate everything scary, dangerous, out of control, and joy, which is this much more radical thing that flashes up. And I think Orwell doesn't give a damn about happiness, but has a lot of joy, moments of joy, and is defending it. But I also think that the defeatism, because it's something I deal with a lot as a climate activist. I've actually started a project with my friend Thelma, Fiji-based climate activist, called Not Too Late, because climate despair is now so terrible a force for people emotionally, but also causing them to think that there's nothing can be done, which means it's a kind of defeatism and surrender when there's so much that's urgent to do. And I wrote Hope in the Dark as an essay in 2003 and as a book in 2004. And my argument has been since that time that both optimism and pessimism are forms of certainty. They assume we know what's going to happen. And the future, and this is kind of what Octavia Butler is saying, the very act of trying to look ahead to discern possibilities and offer warnings is in itself an act of hope. And I think what she means is that when you offer a warning, you say that the outcome is not already determined, that there's still time to participate in deciding what that outcome will be. And so, I've been really interested in trying to both recognizing how uncomfortable people are with uncertainty, how much they'll invent even a gloomy certainty rather than deal with the fact that we don't know what's going to happen, which I think invites us to, or requires us to participate in some way. And and there's been a lot of dumb popular climate stuff saying that it is too late. And there's a very funny essay by the climate journalist Emily Atkins called "The Wheel of First-Time Climate Dudes," where these guys are like, "Oh my God, I read about climate. Do you know how bad it is? Whoa!" And really kind of like spread a lot of gloom in a not very informed way. And the scientists, we know exactly what we need to do. We have everything except the political will to overcome the financial and fossil fuel and political interests, and the technology is fine, etc. And and I don't really worry about utopia. I worry about what we do, because it will never happen except as like brief moments of joy. I worry about the things people are willing to do in quest of utopia, which is, as I think, Orwell with, watching the Soviet Union, which we're going to make a perfect society by getting rid of everybody who doesn't fit into it perfectly. And so...
Well, I mean, we could spend more time talking about certainty and its exigencies and its dangers, and perhaps we will, but I want to throw the floor open to questions. There will be a roving mic, which I can see is now coming forward. So, hands, who's going to ask a first question? I know there's going to be one out there.
Maybe it's all on you. But be bold, people.
There's one here at the back.
Oh, yay, thank you.
Yes, just had a question about the woman at the end who's doing her washing. And the way you described it reminded me a bit of a painting of a milkmaid by Vermeer. And that has both a moment in time which is very almost spiritual, and I was just wondering if you could comment on whether you think aspects of the sense of spirituality in art and Orwell capturing that moment amongst somebody in the working class, whether you think there's a sort of connection between the two.
The connection to...
For me, as painting of the milkmaid.
And that's such a direct connection, and there's nothing to assume it. But it is this kind of wonder. It does. I hadn't thought of it that way, but it does feel almost like a classical painting in some sense. This great, powerful female figure, a kind of goddess or muse. At the same time that Orwell, deplores this, or Winston deplores the song as banal that she's singing. One of those songs ground out for the pearls to sing, the kind of pop tunes of the regime. And she's hanging out diapers, which also don't have quite so much romantic resonance. But I think it's the very fact that in the midst of all that, she's still, that line that she could have been doing this for 1,000 years, that she seems kind of eternal and inexhaustible. That's part of what's remarkable about her. So thank you.
More hands? There we are.
Thank you for the beautiful lecture and discussion. And apologies ahead if my question is not as beautifully articulated. I'm not even maybe sure I can collect it into a question, so maybe it'll be more of a reaction. But I was thinking about, to me, this iconography of nature and its relationship to joy has become really complicated with sort of thinking about like what exactly is entailed in the imaginary of sort of wilderness. So I'm thinking, for example, about the fact that like 15% of Tanzanian land is captured into these sort of conservation parks, modeled after some kind of ideal of a primordial world or a world that's untouched by industrial polluting activities, or how perhaps more modern also sort of land, or what some people call neocolonialism, is being sort of enclosed in places like Indonesia or Malaysia as a carbon offset practice. So I guess I'm sort of trying to grapple with the joy that I also find that spring or birds can give me in my life, while also perhaps this image is more imagined or sort of also tainted with a kind of coloniality.
Tainted with what?
A kind of coloniality, or a kind of sort of imagined more than real wilderness.
Wilderness is such a problematic concept, and I was part of the discourse in the early 1990s when the American environmental movement, which was very white, was finally recognizing that there essentially is no, because people routinely talked of a nature-culture divide as though culture was unnatural and nature was somehow a separate sphere. And fully recognizing the presence of indigenous people over almost the entire Earth, minus Antarctica and a few really bleak places, is recognizing that they weren't separate. There was no wilderness. And I think it's been two remarkable things have come of that. One of indigenous people have been leading a lot of the key parts of the climate movement, but also have offered us a vision that culture doesn't have to be at war, was never separate from nature, was never a co-equal but separate sphere, but also that it's possible to live with nature rather than against it and in a destructive way. Behind the national park system in the US was part of a kind of Madonna whore thing in which nature is female. This part of it will like protect and keep utterly pure. The 1964 American Wilderness Act, which is a good act, but it says wilderness is a place in which man is only a visitor, which I've always said doesn't apply to women, but it's really about that kind of false separateness and that false binary. So I feel like in our time, like the fact that there's PCBs in the milk of Arctic mammals, including humans, is incredibly grim. But the fact that since we don't have to worry about a pure and separate nature, we've been relieved of that at the same time that we see glaciers melting and other kinds of terrifying change take place. But and one of the things I like about Orwell is the sense that it can just be, a toad, a bird singing, a flower on a rubble heap, that you don't need the absolute pristine thing. And of course, here I am in Britain, I've spent time in parts of the United States that are really, really remote, and the old systems in which, are really, really intact, and Britain is beautiful, and you all haven't had that for centuries or maybe millennia. So I think it's partly learning to love an imperfect nature, and but also it feels like a kind of reversal. We're so powerful now that rather than nature protecting us, we protect it, this kind of parent-child reversal that's, I wish had never come to pass, but we can at least try and do it right.
Is there another? There's a hand over here, and let's go there and then here.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
The lights are so bright, which is why I'm shading my eyes. They were like, oh, the lights are very bright, and I was like, oh, they're great, and they were from there. Now, it's just like the interrogation chamber in 1984.
Kind of going off of the conversation about learning from indigenous peoples, there's this book you might have heard of called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Kimmerer.
Braiding Sweetgrass, did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things, it talks about how indigenous people take knowledge and learning from plants and see them as sort of equals with spirits. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading it was just that the author mentions this idea that, so in environmentalism, a lot of people, activists always talk about how we love nature, we want to protect it and everything, but they don't actually ask if nature can love us back. So I don't know if you just had any thoughts on that, sort of whether the relationship of love should be reciprocal, and how that can be explored in environmentalism more.
I have been saying for a long time, I think I say in the Far Away Nearby that places, I talk about giving a talk to students a dozen years ago, telling them that places love you back, and I don't want to anthropomorphize places. And that Barry Lopez has a new posthumous anthology of essays I wrote the intro for, and make the same point. And I think love you back in that they take care of you, they provide for you, they anchor you, and they're the most stable things you're going to have. People are going to die. And of course, not all places are stable. I'm in California, so much, I know a lot of people who are deeply distressed because the places they love have burned. Some of them are fire does many different things, and some of them are regenerating, some of them not so much. But, and indigenous culture, there's a wonderful book by Keith Basso, who is a white anthropologist, but working really closely for decades with the White Earth Apache. And he wrote a book called Wisdom Sits in Places about, and a lot of the Western U.S. indigenous cultures are a bit like the Aboriginal songlines some of you may know more about, and the idea that there are stories embedded in the landscape. They guide you, they teach you, they remind you. Leslie Marmon Silko, the native, right? And she's actually Laguna Pueblo? Yeah. Writer also talks about that, places that will chastise you if you've done something wrong, that will remind you, and this sense of narrative embedded in place. And I think we all have some of it where places are with memories, individual memories embedded in place, if not collective memories. So I think that places do love us back in some sense. And of course, we are animals ourselves. We are mammals and biological creatures that absolutely depend on the natural world. I'm really, I used to be proud to be from San Francisco when it was the city of Harvey Milk and the founding of, the first environmental group in the world, and experimental poetry and dance and things like that. Now I'm from the land of Airbnb and Facebook and Google and Twitter and other monstrosities, and less so. And I've been really disturbed by the tech oligarchs who are obsessed with space travel, which I think comes from, and immortality, two forms of profound alienation from biological reality, and that think that we're not anchored to these things. And I think also that, have not paid enough attention to the reality to the beauty of the world, the complexity of it, the richness of it, the fact that, which might be some of the ways you could say it loves us. And immortality is also failing to understand us as biological, and I think is also about the fact that people who are consuming way more than they should want to do it forever. The thing you can say about people with private jets is at least they'll only live 90 years, but now they want to live 9,000. So, but yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass has been kind of a fascinating book because it was published by a small press, and who thought that a native, scientist could write a book that would become such a completely huge and influential bestseller. And it's one of the things I love about the publishing industry also, is that it too is unpredictable in what, what people suddenly want to read. So.
I think that probably, I might
We
take
had
one more.
question.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah.
Hi. It's all been very interesting, thank you. You talked a little bit about gardens having this sort of conservative history in your discussion. And I think a lot about gardening as sort of tied up in private property inherently, whether that's enclosure on a grand scale and building, beautiful sort of aristocratic gardens, or the fact that, you garden when you have a garden and when you don't have a landlord who will tell you that you can't. And maybe we're all kind of happy with a tension that, yeah, there's a conservative history to gardening, but we can see radical potential in it and we live in the world. But practically speaking, I've seen a lot of community gardens come and go and fail, or come under enormous pressures from, being evicted or finding people to be able to tend them. I was just wondering, from your experience, what ways of opening up gardening, beyond the sort of one suburban homeowner who can do it in their garden, what ways do you think work to bring everybody into it so it's something that we can all do?
I think allotment gardens, which are huge in Germany, you have here, and we have to some extent in the US, are great. And community gardens, guerrilla gardening, the idea that even in just a flower box on a windowsill can be a garden. And then public gardens. And, because I don't think you have to actually do the work to enjoy it. And so I think public parks are like public libraries, one of the kind of great democratic institutions, and and making it fully available and not criminalizing people who are brown or black. Being in those spaces is also part of the work that has been happening a bit in the national parks in the U.S. as well. So, and also there's a lot of interesting models now of community-supported agriculture where people have deep relationships with a farm, and there's one version in the US where you just get a box every week from the farm, but there are also versions where people come out and participate in the harvest and things and other kinds of stuff. My little great nieces go to some of the berry farms and pick berries now and again so that you get to pick it yourself. And I was a great trespasser and picker of other people's fruit as a kid. And I don't think we had one very sad apple tree in the suburban house I grew up in. My parents were inner city kids and from East LA and Brooklyn and Queens. And, but there were pomegranates and all, the streets were lined with plum trees. And there was arches of Concord grapes and things. And I was a flower and fruit thief growing up. So I'll support guerrilla stuff too. I believe that in Israel there's a kind of biblical injunction that you can't remove fruit from somebody's property, but you can sit under a tree and eat it. That's not theft, which I think is kind of great. Just like right of way deprivatizes property here. So, but I think it's a real concern, and how can it be for everyone, and how do we open up space in various ways and invite people? and also invite inner city kids to just have relationships to where their food comes from, which is something, and the food revolution has been upscale gourmet nonsense at one end, but at the other end it has been wanting to kind of put back together broken systems and relationships. That's been kind of wonderful. So thank you, and that might be not a bad place to end.
Yes, I think that is where we'll call an end to it, and I suppose I will just say thank you for such an extraordinary sort of multi-leveled and branching lecture and conversation, much like a rose itself. And I will hand a mic over to Ken, who's going to say a few things. But first, I will ask you to put your hands together for Rebecca Solnit.
Well, gosh, that was loud. I just wanted to, it's right in front of the speaker. I just wanted, on behalf of the trustees of the foundation, to thank you, Rebecca, for such a rich and richly roaming talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And in the way it roamed across Orwell in such a, I think, sensitive way, reminded me of Ian McEwan's lecture last year, and it was a wonderful compliment to that. So thank you very much. And thank you, James, for chairing that. I also want to thank the Orwell office, who have done an enormous amount of work putting this festival together, and in particular Jordan Dilworth and James Tukey, who are here somewhere and have done a really huge amount of work, and Liz Wallace standing at the back, who's our deputy director, and of course Jean, who's our director. Can I encourage you to visit, to attend some of the other events coming up? We've got, if we go back a page to the first page, we've got tomorrow night we've got Richard Evans, the Regius Professor of History Emeritus at Cambridge, and Dominic Cummings, Gideon Rachman and Ketcher Hoyer talking about Bismarck and political power, and I think that's going to be a really fascinating discussion. We've got Kojo Koram and Grace Blakely talking about Kojo's recent book. We've got Catherine Belton, the famous, courageous Catherine Belton, and Joshua Yaffa talking about Putin and the people. And then if you just flick on a page, we've got Yara Rodriguez Fowler. I saw an event last night, actually, and Isabel Wadner talking about their shortlisted books for the Fiction Prize. Chris Patton on his Hong Kong diaries, and I don't need to read them all. You've got the booklets, but there's a fascinating series. Perhaps you could just flick through them for us. And I think there are spaces available still for all of these events. I don't know, are there still some spaces for tomorrow night, Jean? I think there are. Many of them are being streamed. So please do support the Orwell Foundation by attending them, not just to support us, but because I think they're going to be fascinating talks, events, panel discussions, debates in their own right. So you'll be very welcome. Thank you all again for attending. Thank you, Rebecca, again for a wonderful lecture. I'm sorry if you're slightly jet-lagged, but you didn't show it, I have to say.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to the Orwell Foundation and my lovely editor at Granta, Bella here, and to Quentin and the people from the Orwell Society here as well. And thank you all for coming to listen.
Thank you. Thank you to the LRB, and thank you to Substack.
Oh yeah, right, and the LRB.
Yeah, and if you don't subscribe to it, you should.